Welcome to this explainer. It's pretty wild to think about how just one single action can kick off a massive, completely invisible chain reaction across the entire globe, right? Well, today, we're tracking those exact dominoes. We'll be looking at how absolutely everything on our planet is deeply interconnected, from the very air we breathe right down to the deepest lakes on Earth. Here is what we're looking at today. First, we'll cover air pollution and acid rain. Second, the enhanced greenhouse effect. Third, the consequences of global warming. And finally, eutrophication and water pollution. Let's get right into it. Part 1, air pollution and acid rain. So, when we talk about the biological consequences of air pollution, we really have to spotlight two major culprits here. First up is carbon monoxide. This stuff is incredibly dangerous because it literally hijacks your blood. It actively binds to your hemoglobin, blocking oxygen from getting around your body. And if you inhale enough of it, it literally causes suffocation. Then we have sulfur dioxide. Breathing this in is going to give you some nasty respiratory problems right off the bat. But as we're about to see, the damage definitely doesn't stop at our lungs. Once this gas hits the atmosphere, it creates acid rain, which is an absolute nightmare for plants, soil, and aquatic life. Let's trace exactly how this happens. It starts right at the source. Factories and cars pumping out acidic gases like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. But they don't just hover there. The wind catches these gases and can literally blow them across entire countries. Once they're way up in the atmosphere, they dissolve into the water vapor inside the clouds. So when it finally rains or snows, it's coming down as acid rain, heavily damaging forests, lakes, and rivers miles and miles away from where that pollution actually started. Okay, so we know local pollution can easily become a neighboring region's problem. But what happens when these harmful gases don't just fall back down as rain, and instead just keep rising, wrapping around the entire planet? Part 2, the enhanced greenhouse effect. Our atmosphere actually contains a very specific natural mix of gases that act almost like a thermal blanket. They're uniquely designed to absorb heat from the sun. The major players hanging out up there are water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, and CFCs. But here is the absolutely crucial distinction we need to make today. There's the natural greenhouse effect and the enhanced greenhouse effect. The natural one, we literally need it to survive. It's what keeps the Earth warm enough to sustain life. The enhanced greenhouse effect, on the other hand, is human-driven. It happens when we pump way too much of these gases into the air. It thickens that atmospheric blanket, traps way too much heat, and naturally, that drives up the Earth's average temperature, leading straight to global warming. Let's break down the actual mechanics of how this trapping works. Solar radiation, the sun's rays, beams right through our atmosphere, and the Earth's surface absorbs that energy. The Earth then naturally re-emits that energy back out at longer wavelengths as infrared radiation, which is basically heat. Normally, a lot of that heat just escapes back out into space. But when you have this thick layer of greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, they intercept it. They absorb that escaping heat and bounce it back in all directions. It's literally trapped, causing the whole planet to heat up. So where is all this extra gas actually coming from? Well, human activities are directly thickening this blanket. We're seeing carbon dioxide absolutely skyrocket because of how much fossil fuel we're burning. And methane? This one actually surprises a lot of people. Methane levels are surging largely because of our agricultural practices. We're talking about massive amounts of methane burped out by cattle as they digest grass, plus enormous quantities released from flooded rice paddy fields. Part 3, consequences of global warming. And as you can guess, all this trapped heat sets off a completely devastating biological cascade. It kicks off in the oceans. Rising temperatures cause polar ice caps to melt and trigger these massive, tragic coral bleaching events. All that extra thermal energy also supercharges our weather systems, fueling monster storms and brutal droughts. Naturally, these extremes wipe out habitats, completely fracturing food chains and accelerating biodiversity loss. And when an environment totally degrades, species are forced to flee, which ends up rapidly spreading new pests and diseases to entirely new parts of the globe. All right, so we've mapped out the air around us and the atmosphere high above us. But what happens when pollution skips the air entirely and just flows directly into our local waterways? Part 4, eutrophication and water pollution. This brings us to a really fascinating yet destructive process called eutrophication. Honestly, it's a deeply ironic problem because it's caused by having way too many nutrients. It happens when minerals, specifically nitrates from farm fertilizers, get washed into local lakes and streams by heavy rain. Normally, nitrates are great for plant growth, right? But when massive, unnatural amounts of them flood a waterway, they cause an explosive overgrowth of aquatic plants and algae right on the water's surface. Let's walk through this fatal chain reaction step by step. First, the fertilizer runoff triggers this massive algae bloom. Because the algae spreads across the entire surface of the water, it essentially blocks out the sun. No sunlight means the aquatic plants living down below just die off. Next, decomposers, think bacteria and fungi, they have an absolute feast. They multiply like crazy to break down all those dead plants. But here's the real kicker. As those decomposer populations explode, they breathe a lot. Their respiration sucks up almost all the dissolved oxygen in the water. So ultimately, aquatic organisms that need oxygen to survive, like fish, they just suffocate and die. Following these stages visually, it's really striking. You get that initial fertilizer runoff, which immediately feeds that thick, green algal shield on the surface. That blocks the sun, the deep plants die off, and they start accumulating at the bottom. That decaying matter feeds the decomposers, and they just completely strip the oxygen from the water, ultimately leading to the physical suffocation of the fish. It's literally an entire complex aquatic ecosystem completely destroyed by a single runoff event from a nearby farm. Now, a very similar and arguably grosser chain reaction happens with raw sewage pollution. Say a sewer overflows or heavy rains wash animal waste off a field into a river. Instead of feeding algae, this raw waste directly feeds aerobic bacteria. And just like those decomposers we just looked at, these bacteria multiply rapidly, aggressively consuming the biological waste and gobbling up the water's dissolved oxygen. Suddenly, only organisms that can survive on almost zero oxygen are left, drastically tanking the aquatic biodiversity. And to make matters worse, this sewage also dumps dangerous, disease-causing pathogenic bacteria straight into the water supply. To wrap up this explainer, we really have to recognize a pretty unavoidable truth. From the sulfur dioxide we pump up into the clouds to the nitrogen we wash into our local lakes, our actions are essentially the first domino in a deeply, deeply interconnected biological chain. Absolutely everything is linked. So if the survival of these intricate ecosystems ultimately dictates our own, how many dominoes can we really afford to knock over before the chain finally reaches us? Thanks so much for exploring this with me, and stay curious.